Hello there. Good afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, my name's David David Peters Corbett, and I run the Centre for American Art, which is hosting this lecture by John Blakinger this evening. So very welcome to everybody. I will introduce John, and then John will talk, and then we'll have an opportunity for a Q&A. After which there is a glass of wine for people. I hope you'll join us for that. And that will be a little bit further down the corridor, but I'll mention that again at the end. So I'm very happy and delighted, in fact, to welcome John Blakinger, who is the Terra Visiting Professor in American Art for 2018-19 at the University of Oxford. John was previously at the University of Southern California, where he was in the Society of Fellows in the Humanities. He studies modern and contemporary American art with a focus on the relationship between aesthetics and politics, and he's particularly interested in the intersection of the visual arts with science and technology. His book with MIT Press on the Hungarian-American artist, designer, and visual theorist György Kepes will be published next month, June 2019. That project explores the fraught relationship between art, science, and military power during the Cold War through Kepes's unusual interdisciplinary collaborations. John also curated a 2014 exhibition of Kepes's photography at Stanford, a show which travelled to Liverpool John Moores University in 2015. His other research has explored topics ranging from Andy Warhol's Death in America paintings to the Sao Paulo biennial, and his writing has appeared in Tate Papers, CAA reviews, and in other venues. A book on art and camouflage was published in French in 2014. John's working on two projects during his time at Oxford. The first examines visual representation as an arena for symbolic struggle through contemporary protest imagery. The second, which I think we're going to hear about this evening, explores the transnational globalization of American art through the Rauschenberg Overseas Culture Interchange, a program conceived by Robert Rauschenberg in the 1980s. And just before I turn over to John, I should with great pleasure, hold up his poster for a series of lectures, A Contest of Images, American Art as Culture War, by John, which are taking place in Oxford over the next few weeks, and which start on Wednesday, is that right, at Worcester College. So there's some more publicity about that in the front. If anybody's interested, as I'm sure you will be, please have a look at that, and if you'd like to attend, that would be great. I'm now going to turn over to John. His title tonight, last time I did this, the title had changed. The World is My Palette, Rauschenberg's Overseas Culture Interchange. John.
Okay, so first I want to thank David for the very generous introduction. And I also want to thank Jo Applin, if she's here, because she in part also suggested that I might make a good lecture here for this series in American art. So, to begin, I'm going to start with a photograph, an image that depicts the artist Robert Rauschenberg with United Nations Secretary General Javier Perez de Cuellar at UN headquarters in New York in 1984. It was here that Rauschenberg announced the formation of an ambitious new project, the Rauschenberg Overseas Culture Interchange, commonly known by the acronym ROCI. The photograph is surprising. The fact that Rauschenberg is at the UN is itself remarkable. He holds a work of art in his hands, a print made for the occasion. It was presented to the Secretary General, but also to the many UN delegates in attendance. There were 150 dignitaries in the room. The artist's expression, a wide grin, a gleeful look toward the camera, is incongruous next to the Secretary General's more muted gaze. I see bewilderment on the Secretary General's face, confusion. He looks perplexed. What has he gotten himself into? Who is Robert Rauschenberg, and why is he at the UN? Secretary General Pérez de Cuellar was a Peruvian diplomat who served posts in France, the United Kingdom, Bolivia, and Brazil. He was an ambassador of Peru to Switzerland, the Soviet Union, Poland, and Venezuela. At the UN, he led mediations between the UK and Argentina after the Falklands War. He promoted peace in Central America. He interceded in the negotiations for the independence of Namibia. He worked to solve diplomatic crises in Morocco, Croatia, and Cyprus. He was a prominent figure of world politics, not the art world. Why is he standing next to an artist? The meeting and its setting are surprising, but I am also puzzled by what initially appears as mere backdrop and background. The painting on the wall behind them. It depicts the German city of Hamburg. It was painted in oil on canvas by Oskar Kokoschka in 1951. It shows the city's port restored after the catastrophic events of the Second World War, events that resulted, of course, from the nationalistic advance of the Third Reich. The city was destroyed during the war by bombing campaigns that killed thousands. But here, rebuilt, the city thrives, a bustling metropolis. Once closed to the world under dictatorial rule, is now open to all. Its docks and harbors busy, a multicolored, multicultural tableau. Shipping cranes dot the foreground, a stream of boats pours across the canvas, and a dense array of color illuminates the cityscape. The painting represents resurgent global trade after the fragmentation of mid-century and the unifying force of international, transnational exchange. Rauschenberg's ROCI print, so the print he's actually presenting to the Secretary General, mirrors the painting in formal terms. And it is perhaps for this reason that the Kokoschka was selected as the setting for Rauschenberg's publicity shot. The print contains a seemingly random assemblage of images, a bicycle, a clock, a sculpture, all layered under brushstrokes of vivid color. It evokes, in a way, the city landscape. Indeed, the painting and the print both seem to be emblems of ROCI, of Rauschenberg's global ambitions. They suggest not just international and transnational exchange, but a new imagined global community, a new multiculturalism, an openness to the world and its visual culture, a cosmopolitan sensibility. Rauschenberg's UN PR stunt was the official send-off for what became a multi-year globe-trotting extravaganza. The artist initially conceived of the project in the 1970s as a Robert Rauschenberg Round the World Tour, a conventional traveling exhibition with a fixed checklist of works made in the US, then circulated abroad. But as the Rauschenberg overseas culture interchange, the project became more elaborate. The artist traveled to host countries in advance, photographing the people and places he discovered. Working collaboratively with locals, he learned artisanal techniques, used indigenous materials, appropriated found fabrics and printed matter from the community. All these varied sources filtered into his combine-like collages. Moreover, each stop on the ROCI tour also presented works from previous stops, creating a flexible, open-ended format that created new encounters between works from different countries and cultures. The ROCI acronym symbolized these aims. It was a reference to Rauschenberg's pet turtle, Rocky, a prop the artist once used in a 1965 performance piece. But it was also a reference to the world turtle, a common feature of Chinese, Hindu, and Native American mythology, all of which included variations of a tortoise that carried the weight of the world on its back, as in, for example, this 1876 drawing of the Hindu version of the myth. The world turtle became an essential part of ROCI's visual culture, placed on invitations, posters, catalogs, and letterhead. In a way, Rauschenberg was the turtle. The itinerary was extraordinary in its range. Rauschenberg initially hoped to visit 22 countries in just 4 years, thus circling the globe with a nonstop, around-the-clock intensity. The sun would never set on ROCI. In the end, due to the logistical complexity and the cost, he only reached 10 foreign cities, even though the program dragged on for a total of 7 years. ROCI destinations focused on what Rauschenberg euphemistically termed sensitive nations, nations under totalitarian regimes, or countries that were closed to the West or economically developing. In chronological order, these included the capital cities of Mexico, Chile, Venezuela, China, Tibet, Japan, Cuba, the Soviet Union, East Germany, and Malaysia. And to give you a sense of this, I have posters from most of these locations in the same order that Rauschenberg visits. So these are the promotional posters which he also produces as works of art. So this is Japan, Cuba, USSR, East Germany, and finally Malaysia. Most of these destinations were indeed, quote unquote, sensitive. Many suffered under oppressive governments, specifically totalitarian communist governments, and had severe limits on freedom of expression. China, Cuba, the Soviet Union, and East Germany were all behind the Iron Curtain. Chile was under the dictatorial grip of Augusto Pinochet. Tibet was occupied by China. Venezuela was beset with economic crises. There were plans for trips to other areas of geopolitical unrest: Yugoslavia, Vietnam, Sri Lanka, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Morocco, Egypt, South Africa. To cap off this global marathon, Rauschenberg returned home in 1991 for the 11th and final stop, ROCI, USA, at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., where works from each preceding visit, as well as new ones made in the States, were exhibited, forming a conclusion to his impressive multi-year project. And this is the poster for ROCI, USA. So one thing to emphasize, which should now be clear, is that the model is really a sort of center and periphery model, with the US as the center, and then a constellation of sites that he visits that sort of orbit around Washington, D.C. as the final end point of his tour. ROCI was framed by the artist's unique "we are the world" multiculturalism. Quote, "The purpose is to promote peace through active communication with art," end quote. Its founding document was a 1984 manifesto written by the artist during a Caribbean vacation and known as the Tobago Statement. And he writes this when he's on vacation, which I think is also another important part of this project to emphasize. In his archives from ROCI, there are photos of him on vacation in USSR, in Moscow, in China, and on the Amazon River in Brazil. And this is his statement. Quote, "The Rauschenberg Overseas Culture Interchange is a 4-year private project taking, making, and exchanging art and facts around the world. Emphasis will be placed on sharing experiences with societies less familiar with non-political ideas or communicating worldly through art. A selection of works done in or influenced by participating countries will then continue to travel, including videos, photos, sound, drawings, prints, and catalogs to the next country, systemically eclipsing the opening exhibit, which functions as a catalyst, enabling the international exhibition and collaboration to exist and grow. I feel strong in my beliefs, based on my varied and widely traveled collaborations, that a one-to-one contact through art contains potent, peaceful powers." End quote. Rauschenberg presents the entire project as purely apolitical, concerned with non-political ideas, communicating worldly, and sharing experiences. Such banalities repeat ad nauseum throughout Rauschenberg's statements about the project, in media coverage, catalog essays, and interviews. He wanted to, quote, "give more to the world," end quote. It is not surprising that the art critical establishment considered ROCI ridiculous, indulgent, embarrassing, riddled with cliches and platitudes, and ultimately irrelevant. Reviewing ROCI USA at the National Gallery, the critic Roberta Smith notes, quote, "ROCI is one man's attempt to promote world peace and understanding through the production of art, his own," end quote. She calls it at once altruistic and self-aggrandizing. She calls it cultural imperialism. And she had a point. Rauschenberg conceived of the entire world as artistic subject and material. Quote, "The whole world is my palette." The phrase stuck, appearing as the title of a cover article in Art News. Elsewhere, he would reverse the phrase, "The world is my gallery," thus collapsing the distinction between making art abroad and selling it, an ambiguity I will revisit later in this talk. I am struck, for example, by footage from a ROCI travelogue that shows the artist placing a large medallion of his own likeness and name on the facade of the National Museum of Fine Arts in Santiago, Chile. He now appears next to Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael. Could there be a more self-aggrandizing gesture, a more imperial gesture? And I'm going to show footage of him doing this. And this is in Santiago, Chile. This all brings me to the core question that I want to think about today. How do we interpret ROCI now, decades later? Other art historians have largely reiterated Roberta Smith's criticism, understanding the project as simultaneously selfless and self-serving. But I want to go further. I want to move beyond a consideration of just the artist and his ego or lack of ego. I want to argue that ROCI is interesting and indeed relevant, contrary to Smith, because it serves as a remarkable case study for the rapidly changing structure of the art world at a crucial but also ambiguous moment. ROCI spans the fall of communism and the rise of a new world order. It is balanced precariously at the end of the Cold War and at the beginning of transnational neoliberal globalization. It thus sits between two distinct art historical paradigms that have framed our thinking about how American art operates in global contexts. It is similar to, but also different from, these paradigms. In the first such model, associated with the art of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, American painting, specifically abstract expressionism or New York school painting, functioned as political propaganda in a Cold War battle of the images. And this is a history that's probably very well known to many of you. Max Kozloff first described the ideological operations of such canvases. Their abstraction, their seemingly blank quality, allowed them to become sites for projection, for viewers to see the openness of their aesthetics as coded political messages. Formal qualities reflecting expression were transvalued as statements about freedom of expression, about political, cultural, and economic freedom. Ava Cockcroft extended this analysis still further, revealing not only how formal qualities permitted readings of political content, but also how specific structural links, an umbilical cord of gold, to use the words of Clement Greenberg, between the U.S. government and arts institutions allowed the art to become, in her resonant phrase, a weapon of the Cold War. She specifically identifies the ties between the United States Information Agency, or USIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, and the International Council of the Museum of Modern Art, or MoMA, in New York. She even ties single figures like Nelson Rockefeller to these institutions and their foreign policy objectives. The second model, associated with the art of the 1990s, 2000s, and today, describes how a circuit of biennials, jet-setting art world elites, and frenzied consumerism sustain a burgeoning global art market that emerged in the aftermath of the Cold War. Such a model often raises troubling questions about how the contemporary art world embraces international and transnational exchange through a center and periphery structure. Capital from the West infiltrates new markets, often resulting in uneven economic development as well as rampant consumerism. ROCI fits such a model well. It seems to reiterate the frenzied itineraries of biennial culture all through the actions of a single figure. Indeed, many host countries specifically considered Rauschenberg's visit a means of accessing Western art markets. I want to use my talk today to explore, particularly through new archival material from Rauschenberg's papers, how the program reflects a collision of these models. It is at once a paradigmatic example of how American culture functioned as soft power during the Cold War, and a paradigmatic example of how American culture became part and parcel of an uneven, globalized art world after the Cold War. ROCI captures a transitional moment unique to the 1980s. It represents a different paradigm at the intersection of these world views. Rauschenberg insisted that ROCI was non-political, but that does not mean it actually was non-political. Rhetoric is misleading. In fact, the first draft of the Tobago Statement includes a telling editorial change. Non-political actually replaced the term Rauschenberg had originally chosen, Western. In other words, non-political ideas was another way of saying Western ideas, American ideas, and sharing these abroad seems to me to be very much a political gesture. Let me be blunt. ROCI practiced politics disguised, its Cold War agenda latent and hidden. It appeared neutral, but it wasn't. In part, Rauschenberg denied the political nature of his project because he disavowed official U.S. government support. And yet, the abstraction of the program into the language of the organization, into ROCI, R-O-C-I, itself calls to mind particular governmental organizations, the USIA, the CIA, the UN. ROCI had a complete organizational apparatus, an official headquarters in Rauschenberg's home state of Florida, run by a secretary general of a sort, ROCI artistic director Donald Saff. In the 1991 catalog for the ROCI USA, held, I might add, at the National Gallery of Art, a national museum that was by definition linked to the US government, Rauschenberg states that he had first explored possible funding for the project through the auspices of the U.S. International Communications Agency, or USICA, the name for the USIA during a brief period around 1980. In fact, Rauschenberg's papers contain an internal report on ROCI from 1987 that details continued discussions with the agency over years about sponsorship. This was, remember, the same agency that promoted the exhibition of color fields and drip paintings decades prior. Of course, ROCI did not need actual state sponsorship to occupy the role of the state. This was, after all, the era of privatizing government services. Think of Reagan and Thatcher. As Donald Saff, the ROCI artistic director, tells Rauschenberg, the US government didn't even have access to countries that were, quote, sensitive enough for you, end quote. So in other words, the idea being that where the US government has access would not be appropriate for Rauschenberg because he actually wants to access countries that even the government does not have diplomatic ties to. In one brazen example of how ROCI privately assumed governmental power, the artist employed transport services from none other than the Chinese Air Force to get works to Lhasa, Tibet from Beijing, China. Recall that Tibet is occupied by China. The fact that Rauschenberg hired the occupying military force to assist in a project ostensibly opposed to China's military occupation is very ironic. Likewise, Rauschenberg paid the Venezuelan Air Force to transfer works from Chile to Venezuela via military aircraft. Documents show that it cost $51,700, or more than $120,000 today. In a strikingly naive remark, Rauschenberg explains his intention to, quote, just keep all the armies and navies and military busy hauling art around so that they won't have time to be aggressive militarily, end quote. This overt reliance on military power suggests how ROCI mimicked and mirrored a global American military presence, despite the artist's claims that it was all just a peacemaking enterprise, despite the fact that it was privately supported. In this way, ROCI must be seen as a reenactment of that earlier Cold War model, even if the ties that bind it to official government agencies are less clear. The impact of Rauschenberg's visits and the responses they generated abroad also reflect the agenda of that earlier model. Let me explain with some examples from the archive. A letter from a woman named Sue Tahansky, a resident of Florida, sent in August 1991 to J. Carter Brown, director of the National Gallery of Art, specifically links ROCI to current events, to political events. Quote, Dear Mr. Brown, the timing of ROCI is perfect. It should be at the National Gallery right now. I saw the exhibit on the 13th, came back to Florida on the 18th, looked up to the numbing news of the coup on the 19th. Then the rest of the week just barreled through with one unbelievable event after another. ROCI helped those people. In fact, after looking at the catalog again, I know ROCI helped. You don't know how instrumental or influential it was for how many. Thank you for sharing Mr. Rauschenberg's world. Sincerely, Sue F. Tahansky. The letter revolves around a series of dates. The date of Tahansky's visit to ROCI USA, but also the date, less than a week earlier, of an attempted coup d'etat in the USSR. On the 19th of August, 1991, a group of hardline communist bureaucrats attempted to oust Mikhail Gorbachev and establish a new Soviet government that would roll back glasnost policies and perestroika and help preserve the USSR. The coup failed and had the opposite effect, accelerating the collapse of the USSR in the weeks that followed. The Soviet Union was officially dissolved later that year. This letter, just the reaction of one completely random viewer, is revealing. Tahansky draws a direct line between Rauschenberg and the end of the Cold War. She implies that Rauschenberg's visit to the USSR helped create a context, maybe a way of seeing, an aesthetic sensibility, in which democracy might take root, thus triggering events that would soon lead to the fall of totalitarian communism, the fall of an American enemy, and allowing, soon thereafter, for the spread of US-backed global capitalism. The artistry in ROCI is not only in the art, the paintings, the combines Rauschenberg made abroad, but also in the foreign policy objectives that ROCI so elegantly achieved. The art was geopolitics. Many saw the program this way, even ROCI staff who ostensibly disavowed political objectives. For example, a letter sent to Donald Saff by Wolfgang Pollock, an East German museum official who helped organize ROCI Berlin, suggests how the program became inextricably tied to current events. After returning to East Germany following a planning visit in the US, he writes, quote, "Back to the GDR. It's my wish to thank everybody whom I met in the USA for the friendly and free discussions, for all the kind support for my English knowledge, and the help for me to understand aspects of American way of life and problems of art and artist life. All these impressions, experiences, and offers for cooperation I took with me to my country, in which has happened big changes in last weeks. A lot is possible now. That change is our chance." End quote. This letter also revolves around significant dates. It was sent on 21 December 1989. The very next day, on the 22nd, Berlin's Brandenburg Gate was opened for the first time in decades, officially setting in motion the reunification of East and West Germany. The Berlin Wall would fall in the months that followed. A post-it note is affixed to a photocopy of the letter. Make several copies. Important. Germany. The note indicates that Saff understood the significance of Pollock's letter as concrete evidence for the program's geopolitical impact. Perhaps the clearest evidence is a letter from none other than Erich Honecker, the East German leader, about Rauschenberg's plans to, quote, organize an exhibition of artworks devoted to peace and understanding among peoples. As you are well aware, the GDR is coming out strongly in favor of the implementation of these ideals, end quote. That line reads to me as an implicit reference to the opening of previously closed communist societies, to glasnost and perestroika. And there are also letters from the likes of Gorbachev and also Fidel Castro, and you know, there's a whole sort of network of people helping Rauschenberg contact political figures that one would imagine is very challenging for an artist to correspond with. But how did ROCI have, as Tahansky calls it, an instrumental and influential role in the fall of communism? Obviously, the structure of the program is key. ROCI is geopolitical in the sense that it targeted nations of great significance in world affairs. But the form of the works collaboratively produced in each country was also crucial. The aesthetics of collaboration were also liberalizing. So I'm interested here in both the structure of the program, but also something about the works that are being created. This quality, this liberalizing quality, is one of the most noted features of the artist's work generally. Think of his canonical white paintings, for example, which functioned like blank screens, surfaces for projection, sites for observing shadows, for the outside world to enter in to aesthetic experience, for aesthetic experience to open up to everything beyond the paint and canvas. Instead of art as ideal object, art embraces the world. Rauschenberg's ROCI works are similar. They create free associations between images, layers of references, a vast spectrum of difference in indeterminate relation. At least the ROCI staff considered this liberalizing quality, the openness of interpretation, the way visual difference was synthesized within Rauschenberg's works of art, to be a primary attribute of the ROCI project that reiterated the ROCI message. As Saff explains in a 1984 statement, quote, "Images are without hierarchy. Rauschenberg's working methodology is always a collaborative process. One image collaborates with another. Paint is merged with photography, technology, screen printing, found objects. A collaboration of images is his aesthetic, and a collaboration of countries is the global concept of this culture interchange exhibition," end quote. The aesthetics of collaboration, of flexible and free association, of freedom are transvalued as statements about international and transnational relationships, and also as uniquely American statements. Quote, "The exhibition makes a powerful statement about America itself," end quote. I have described how ROCI reenacts and restages the familiar story of American art during the Cold War, but it also deviates from that narrative and from the precise ideological messages that had previously circulated in the battle between capitalist and communist. In the era of Reagan and Thatcher, and Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese leader, seen here in a Time magazine cover made by Rauschenberg, the old Cold War binaries no longer applied. Freedom was just another word for deregulated markets, multinational capital flows, and the ability to buy and sell in defiance of the nation state. Only money, not ideological sides, mattered. As I see it, there is a complicated relationship between the global content of Rauschenberg's ROCI works, the visual culture of globalization, and the actual operation of global capitalism at a moment when neoliberalism became a dominant economic but also social and political world model. Let me unpack this argument through a few ROCI works. Rauschenberg often said that he hoped audiences would see themselves in his creations. Saf explains the concept in relation to ROCI Mexico. Quote, "Of primary importance was to have the Mexicans walk into the exhibition and see their own Mexican imagery," end quote. Similarly, the poster for ROCI China included identifiable and stereotyped Chinese imagery, a pig, a Chinese garden, cutouts of smiling Chinese faces. The approach is very problematic. For example, consider a work from ROCI Malaysia. The screen-printed image of an indigenous person overlaid with vivid color makes me very uncomfortable. It seems to reflect a troubling fetishization, not just respect for cultural, racial, and ethnic difference. But it also reminds me of the United Colors of Benetton ads from the period that show models decorated with world flags and tribal paint. All the colors of the world, as the Benetton tagline goes, are here embodied in Rauschenberg's canvases in the most literal of ways: bright green, bright orange, a vibrant slash of pigment. Bright colors mean exotic, primitive. So, I mean, this is all very much consistent with a 1980s fad or fashion for we are the world sort of multicultural imagery. And I'm showing here the Michael Jackson and Lionel Richie album cover, We Are the World. So it's definitely in the zeitgeist of the 1980s, the sort of visual culture of globalization as a representation of multiculturalism and diversity. And of course, I mean, these same We Are the World fads appear in many of the works that are produced. So this is a work from ROCI China, which includes fabrics from China and various imagery. Again, bright colors means exotic. Or another work, Sino Trolley, which includes various cliched images, Tibetan prayer flags, pictures of Buddha, a lion, a yak, etc. To state it all another way, the aesthetics of collaboration were also a form of cultural appropriation, reflecting less collaboration and sharing than an unequal exchange, a conquest of indigenous crafts, imagery, people. Rauschenberg sounds like Gauguin in Tahiti. He was especially fond of, as he explains, quote, the exoticism of Malaysia, where they have the Portuguese, Chinese, Malaysians, and the Indians. And there are so many comments in his own writings and, of course, in his archive that are very cringeworthy in this way. With the Midas touch, the artist turns the culture of the other into artistic masterpieces, then sends them back home to the US, where they might be worth something on the art market. In a canonical 1982 essay, Hal Foster explained how multiculturalism aligns with market forces. He writes, the pluralist position plays right into the ideology of the free market, end quote. Foster's point is that the embrace of difference, despite the inherent value of such a position, despite its possible progressive value, also satisfies the demands of a market that craves diversity. The visual culture of globalization becomes a commodity to be marketed around the globe. World art becomes art world commodity. Rauschenberg, of course, protested such readings of his work. I do it, meaning ROCI, without any complications of commercial intentions, end quote. But can the artist ever be removed from the larger systems that entangle all of us? In that 1987 internal ROCI report that I already mentioned, Saf echoes the sentiment. The usefulness of many of the countries on the planned tour will be of limited value to a corporation seeking fertile markets for their products, end quote. Saf suggests that multinational corporations would not financially support ROCI because it offered little in the way of access to actual economic markets. China, Russia, Cuba, East Germany were, after all, behind the Iron Curtain, closed to capitalism. But we might read this comment the other way, for it ironically suggests exactly why corporations might be interested. These markets were not yet open, not yet fertile, sure, but they would be soon enough. And indeed, correspondence from the National Gallery's archives indicates an interest in locating companies to fund ROCI USA, quote, which may have interest in international visibility, end quote. The gallery specifically cites Westinghouse, Motorola, Boeing Corporation, and Airbus Industries. In his internal report, Saf lists other targets: Mobil Oil, IBM, Atlantic Richfield, Philip Morris. Actually, the National Gallery thought multinational corporations might support ROCI, not because the program offered some sort of access to new markets, but because of the global imprimatur it offered. An internal memorandum from the National Gallery explains how American Airlines was then in the process of negotiating the purchase of airline routes between the US and London, serviced by its competitor, TWA. As part of this effort, American was, quote, heavily embroiled in a Capitol Hill lobbying campaign, end quote. J. Carter Brown called the airline's lobbyist and proposed that American Airlines sponsor ROCI in order to gain a positive visibility in Washington, end quote. This example, merely one of many, suggests how ROCI promoted globalization not only in the sense of accessing new markets, but also by offering an altruistic, globalist glow for companies with financial interests around the world, especially ones whose principal product, air transportation, was so clearly aligned with ROCI's daily operations. Rauschenberg even made personal appeals to these companies. Quote, as the exhibition involved lots of traveling and shipping, I proposed to Pan Am that I would paint one of their planes. It would be the ROCI plane, end quote. In the end, these relationships did not materialize, and Rauschenberg largely financed the project on his own. This included paying out of pocket for the immense cost of shipping, insurance, staff salaries, and of course, flying to exotic locales. And yet, records at the National Gallery also suggest to me how his expensive program may have created new value. It generated wealth. Making art abroad cost money, but the works that resulted, most of which were sent back home, were valuable. To be specific, 92 ROCI works on loan to the National Gallery for ROCI USA, works created at the program's 10 previous stops abroad, were assessed at a value of $21,749,550, or more than $40 million today when corrected for inflation. To be sure, insurance valuations are not indications of actual economic value. They are not sale prices. And yet, that $21 million price tag still points to the way the project generated value. It reminds me of wealth extraction, like the way certain multinational companies might enter foreign markets, extract commodities like oil, then send profits back home. There may, of course, be an economic incentive for host countries, jobs, taxes, but still much of the profit leaves. Let me put all of this another way. Donald Saff estimated to National Gallery employees that the cost of each stop on Rauschenberg's world tour was $300,000. That makes the total cost of the 10 ROCI stops approximately $3 million. In terms of the estimated insurance value of ROCI works, or at least the selection of works that I've cited here, Rauschenberg had a return on investment of more than 7 times the initial cost. I have long been intrigued by ROCI. I first wrote about it as a graduate student in 2010. Then, it was easy to critique the program, to see Rauschenberg's project as cultural imperialism, as cultural appropriation. It was easy to critique ROCI from the left, as part of an argument against both Cold War propaganda and neoliberal globalization, against the way the rhetoric of collaboration across borders actually helps further a geopolitics focused more on opening markets to the West, on extracting aesthetic value for shipment back home. Now, today, however, I am not entirely convinced of such readings. In a moment of profound anti-globalization rhetoric from the right, not the left, the rise of new nationalisms in Europe and the United States, including overt displays of racism and a vitriolic anti-immigrant sentiment, in the age of Brexit and America First, I have trouble rejecting appeals to global multiculturalism. As the world turns away from the utopianism of thinking globally, asserting instead the narrow, small-minded, entrenched interests of the nation state, ROCI and its cosmopolitanism becomes more appealing. To take one of countless examples, some of you may recall remarks made by President Donald Trump last fall during the midterm election in which he evoked nationalism, somewhat ironically, considering the way he has not united the nation, but dangerously divided it against itself. He said, I think this was in the Washington Post, quote, "A globalist is a person who wants the globe to do well, frankly, not caring about our country so much. And you know what? We can't have that. You know, they have a word. It's sort of become old-fashioned. It's called a nationalist. And I say, really, we're not supposed to use that word? You know what I am? I'm a nationalist, okay? I'm a nationalist." End quote. Rauschenberg presents the alternative vision, an imagined community not of nations, not of nationalists, but of the globe. Such a project is problematic for all of the reasons I have detailed today, for its primitivizing approach to the other, for its unequal center and periphery model of exchange, for its relationship to the interests of multinational corporations, for its naive embrace of peace and understanding, but maybe it also has value. One page from Rauschenberg's early writings about ROCI contains a frantic scrawl. It reads, "To stop the world from destroying itself." I'm not willing to give up that mission. The optimism, the idealism of an imagined global community is even more urgent now. Thank you.